Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. Today is Tuesday, April 16th, 2024, and our 5 minutes of grace period has now elapsed, and we will now delve into the formal lecture part of this week's office hour. And after the formal lecture part, we will shut down the recording and then get into Q&A and other matters arising. So welcome to Office Hour Lecture for Module 12. And as I hope you now know, for this week's assessment, our discussion will be on international economic development. Today's lecture will focus on the drivers of economic development. We will also discuss IPE perspective, that is international political economy perspectives, historical materialism, liberal and realistic perspective, on the linkage between economic development and trade relations. Notably, the plight of underdeveloped and poverty-stricken nations has been, at least in part, attributed to the structure of global trade relations. Indeed, many people around the world live in poverty. Most nations in Africa, Asia, Central and South America are economically underdeveloped. As context, there are many places in the world where people live on less than $5 per day. That is $5 US. So, what should an effective theory of development contemplate? Liberal economic thinking holds that a liberalized global market and trading system is the best way to increase economic development and growth because each country specializes in producing the goods and services in which it has comparative advantage. However, this view has been subject to contention for decades. There is evidence that simply removing barriers to trade and opening markets has not led towards the development and growth of underdeveloped and poverty-stricken nations. Rich countries and large corporations dominate the global market and create unequal relations of power and information. Consequently, trade is inherently unequal, and poor countries seldom experience rising out of increasing unemployment, poverty, and income inequality. An additional problem is that free trade is not equally free. Now, it's important to understand the distorting effects of subsidy. And I believe we have covered this in one of our previous assessments. So just to cite one quick example that is currently a hot topic in global trade. As we speak, the Chancellor of Germany, and Chancellor is the German equivalent of a prime minister, is in China conducting trade talks with the Chinese president and the government of China. Chief among the contentious issues is China's automobile industry, in particular, China's electric car industry. Many in the European Union believe that the production and manufacture of these cars are subsidized, and therefore they're able to sell them at below market rates if they're allowed to enter the European market. And this obviously will cannibalize sales, quite likely cannibalize sales for European car manufacturers. On the other hand, Chinese government counters with the fact that it suggests that its cars are less expensive because of efficiencies in their manufacturing techniques, because of the way that companies have created an ecosystem that lends to an efficient manufacture of electric cars, and therefore these are natural competitive advantages that the Chinese auto manufacturers have acquired. And this will be the subject and the backdrop of the economic and trade conversation between these two heads of states. But this is just to highlight some of the tensions that can come, and some of it in this case attributed to subsidy. Furthermore, trade is still dominated by transnational corporations that new trade rules mainly benefit those companies. On the other hand, the liberal view will argue that least developed countries, or LDCs, as I hope you now know, they're often shortened to. On the other hand, liberal view would argue that least developed countries' economic problems stem more from inefficient domestic policies than from their dependent position in the global economy. Indeed, there may be some merit to this argument, but I'm not sure it captures all of the challenges. Liberals, for instance, often see North-South interdependence linkage as providing more benefit for the South than for the North. That is the global South and the global North, just to be sure that we're getting the right context. By this logic, LDCs are least developed countries that follow open economic policies and increase linkages with the global North are, therefore, more likely to achieve development. Although, while all liberals encourage least developed countries to follow open market-oriented policies, interventionist liberals, also called reformist liberals, recognize that North-South inequalities, that is, the global North and global South inequalities, can put LDCs at a disadvantage. Whereas orthodox liberals emphasize equal treatment and reciprocity, interventionist liberals call on the North to consider the special needs of the South. Even so, interventionist liberals believe that the necessary changes can occur within the existing capitalist order, and as such, share the fate of other liberals in private enterprise and the market. Not surprisingly, historical materialists, dependency theorists reject the liberal view that LDC economic problems result from inefficient domestic policies. And this is the counter view. If you'll remember, pretty much every class, I emphasize the importance of dialectical thinking, which is looking at an issue from all sides. To truly understand an issue, you have to look at it and consider all the relevant points, and then come to a conclusion, an informed conclusion. So the counter-argument here from historical materialists, they would argue that dependency theorists reject the liberal view that LDC's economic problems result from inefficient domestic policies. I would just say that not all of it result from inefficient domestic policies. However, instead, historical materialists see capitalist states in the core of the global economy as either underdeveloping LDCs on the periphery or preventing them from attaining genuine autonomous development. And I hope we understand that the core economies are the most developed countries, most industrialized countries, and are considered the core, most of which are in the global North. And the periphery, of course, are those that are less developed countries, and many of which are in the global South. Historical materialists will further argue that class linkages also play a role, with elites in the South, the comprador class, collaborating with capitalists in the North to reinforce the pattern of LDC dependency. So they would argue that to the extent that global trade relations and economic engagement between the global North and the global South is unequal, that indeed that the global North have allyship with the elite in developing countries, otherwise called the comprador class, who are typically their partners in commerce and or leaders in government. Of note, world systems theorists have modified the dependency argument by introducing a third category of countries, the semi-periphery, because some LDCs, such as in East Asia and Latin America, can now be described as newly industrializing economies, or NIEs. Countries may move upwards from the periphery to the semi-periphery, or even to the core, but this only rarely occurs. One quick example where a country has moved from the periphery to the semi-periphery and now a competitor in the core would be China. Others who appear to be moving to the semi-periphery, of course, would include Vietnam, would include Malaysia as an example. And there are those petrodollar economies in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf states, that are somewhere between the semi-periphery and the core. So I just bring those up as an examples of countries that have been able to move up the economic value chain. Whereas some historical materialists call for a redistribution of resources from the core to the periphery, others believe that the core will never willingly transfer resources. So, building on this foundational knowledge, we can now advance the following 4 learning outcomes. Number 1, of course, is to describe the role of the World Bank in promoting and assisting economic development. As we have covered in previous modules, and as has been part of your assessment and is indeed baked into many of your assessments, we should all know by now that the World Bank's core goal is to eliminate poverty. And the World Bank assists countries, member countries, with long-term development projects. That is at the core of the World Bank engagement philosophy. Of course, as is true with World Bank's sister agency, the International Monetary Fund, which obviously is there to ensure monetary stability and therefore facilitation of international trade. There can be sometimes the request or the requirement for regulatory reform as a condition for economic assistance or financial assistance, and this is the popular regulatory reform. So the second learning outcome for the objective for the week is to describe and explain export-led growth strategy. In modern history, of course, colonialism ran an integrated supply chain where you had spices from Asia serving markets in Europe, where you had enslaved people being shipped from Africa to the Americas, be it the Caribbean or North America, where they grew sugar, grew cotton, and the sugar, of course, in part, informed the rum industry, and the cotton, of course, fed the cotton looms of Birmingham and other industrial centers in the United Kingdom that led to economic expansion. The modern day interpretation of this, of course, is quite different. And it is really, again, China that has become the manufacturing capital of the world. So China's growth pattern is a little distinct from the growth pattern of the United States, at least at this stage of our development. By that, I mean that most of China's growth comes from export. A significant part of China's economic growth comes from manufacturing and exporting to the world. In fact, if we were to look around our apartment or our homes, we will quickly realize that many of the stuff we have in there are manufactured in China. On the other hand, within the United States, we have a significant portion of our economic growth is domestic consumption driven. So we consume, we buy, and that creates commerce. So that would be a major strategy for developing countries, which is to manufacture and then sell those goods and services to the core economies or the most advanced economies. The third learning objective, obviously, is to describe and explain import substitution development strategies. Obviously, as I hope we now know, this includes protection and incubation of newly formed domestic industries to fully developed sectors so that the goods produced are competitive with imported goods. So you might want to set up barriers or to competing goods from the international market so that you want to allow space and time for your domestic industries to grow their capacity, their competencies before you open them up to the market up to competition. Because if you open the market, the argument at least is that if the market is open to competition prematurely, it could decimate the nascent domestic market. So the fourth outcome is to explain the infant industry argument and its justification in economic growth strategies. The main rationale, as I hope the class knows by now, behind the infant industry argument is that new industries require protection because they lack the economies of scale that competitors possess. Infant industries lack the capabilities to leverage their existing production and require protection until they can acquire similar economies of scale. Oftentimes, so just to put a big frame on economies of scale, so that I'm sure that we fully understand the phrase. So economies of scale is, let's say that it costs $10 to manufacture 10 widgets. But as you go to 100 widgets, the price will fall to $5, right? Because there is mass production and there is an efficiency that comes from repetitive, and you now have more industrial base to turn out more widgets. The problem, though, is not just in creating the competence and the industrial base to be able to manufacture 100 widgets in this scenario that I've cited. But it's also having the market share, having the demand to support this new manufacturing or production capacity, right? And this is really at the core of economies of scale. You want to be more profitable because you're creating vast quantities of your product or service, and you're providing them more efficient, you're producing them more efficiently. But obviously, producing the widget, and widget in economics is anything that you can think of it, is X goods or service. Producing the widget is half of the equation. The other half of the equation is having the market for it. As they say, if you're not a market leader, you really have two choices. The first one choice would be to determine how much you want to sell your widget. Once you determine how much you want to sell your widget, the market will tell you how many of those widgets you can sell. So that's one of your two options. You could decide how much you want to sell your widget, whether it be flip-flops or a car or a computer. Once you determine the price, the market will tell you how many you can sell. Conversely, you could start by saying, I want to sell 1,000 widgets. When you say that, then the market will tell you the price at which you're going to be able to move 1,000 widgets. Let me tell you quickly what I mean by that. Using a car analogy, I think most people would agree that the standard in SUVs is the Range Rover. So if the Range Rover is priced at, say, $100,000, if Jeep Cherokee wants to sell at $100,000 as an example, he may not get very many buyers because what people really want is a Range Rover. However, if you discount Jeep Cherokee and sell it for $75,000 as an example, although now there are Jeeps that sell for $100,000, but certainly not the Cherokee. But if you now sell it at 75,000, there may be some marginal shoppers for the Range Rover that'll say, you know what, the Cherokee is good enough, or at least I don't believe that the Range Rover is $25,000 better than the Cherokee, so I'm going to buy the Cherokee. And therefore, when you set that price, the market will then decide how many more you can buy. If you set 100,000, you might not get many buyers because all things being equal, people would much rather drive a Range Rover. All things being equal, of course. And I say that because you will quickly realize there are hidden costs to owning a car, as is true for everything. There's the cost of ownership, maintenance, gas, etc., insurance being not the least among them. But anyhow, this concludes our Module 12 lecture. And for next week, our focus will be on the international debt crisis. And with that, I am going to turn off the video, and we can now move forward to our Q&A.